Good morning, our dear viewers, and welcome back to The Other Perspective. Happy New Year. We hope you all enjoyed the festive season. Today is our first episode of the new year, and we're very excited to dive right into the conversation. As usual, kindly press the like button down below and share and subscribe. The topic of discussion today is political competition alongside dialogue. Is this a myth or reality for Uganda? To give you some context, political party dialogue in polarized societies is the best path to achieve inclusive solutions to institutional weakness or politics of identity. In the year 2010, the Inter-Party Organization for Dialogue, IPOD, was set up as a dialogue platform for all political parties represented in Uganda's parliament. Its formation was intended to enhance cooperation and collaboration across parties, and commitment was made towards putting Uganda first. This platform brings together political parties from both the ruling and opposition parties under one umbrella to ensure the growth of a vibrant, well-functioning multi-party democracy in Uganda. One of the reasons IPOD was formed was to promote inter-party dialogue and cooperation as a means for dealing with political differences and managing conflict without resorting to undemocratic means, including violence. We can agree, however, that in the past 10 years of IPOD's existence in Uganda, the democratic space has shrunk, going from bad to worse every successive year. And this is what brings us to today's discussion on whether political dialogue can really thrive alongside political competition in Uganda. With me to discuss this are three gentlemen. And firstly, we have Mr. Fred Musisi, who is a playwright and a renowned pro-democracy activist in Uganda. Fred, you're most welcome to the show.
Thank you, Liz. I'm very glad to be part of this discussion this morning.
Thank you, too. And secondly, we have Mr. Esero Abel. Abel is a political scientist, and you're most welcome to the show. Abel, can we see you?
Yes, thank you, Liz, and Happy New Year to all the viewers.
Thirdly, we have a Pan-Africanist and electro-democracy expert, Mr. Henry Muguzi. Henry, you're welcome to the show.
Thank you, Liz. Happy New Year, viewers. Always a pleasure to be here and talk about a subject that is quite passionate to all of us.
So let's get right into the conversation. And I'm going to start with you, Fred. What do you think necessitated IPOD's existence in Uganda? Was it the right intervention at the time it was formed?
Thank you again, and Happy New Year, dear viewers. Well, as you did mention in your opening remarks, the objective is well set. It's about cooperation to avoid conflict after elections so that we can build our democracy as a country through dialogue as an option. But the question, I think, is supposed to lead us into the direction whether this objective is actually being pursued the right way. When we look at what is happening, I believe that as Ugandans, all of us, we want a very stable country. For those in politics and those outside the politics, we don't want to be destabilized in any way. But if there is such a platform like IPOD, and then we hear some political parties, entities that we believe understand this concept better than other Ugandans, but some of them are actually resisting to be part of it, then we have to rethink this question. What actually necessitated the formation of this IPOD? Was it the right intervention? Is it being done for the right reasons? What do we see on ground? As a playwright, it is very important always to look at the characters involved in any scenario. What is the behavior of the main characters in this scenario? Are they actually leading us into that objective that is on paper? because it's one thing having an objective on paper, but it's another actually pursuing it. But from what we can see, it seems there is a bit of a problem. That's why IPOD is facing this kind of resistance from some of the parties. So I don't know whether this is the right moment for me to look at this, because I mentioned characters, and I'd like to talk about parties as characters. Okay, in this whole discussion, I want to look at as the characters. Um, we call them antagonists and protagonists in the writing profession. When you look at modern democracy, in modern representative democracy, political parties play a very important role, which includes getting information, knowledge, and demands from
Fred, we seem to be having issues with our connectivity. Henry, Henry, can you hear me?
Yes, I am here, Lisa, as you can see.
Yes.
And I want to pick it up from where Fred left it. I think the idea of IPOD starts in Uganda in earnest in 2011. And we do know that it was at the invitation of the Super Prime Minister, Right Honorable John Patrick Amama Mbabazi. When they set up, when NIMD comes to Uganda in 2011, and 12 rather, and sets up IPOD, it was against a backdrop of an election of the general election of 2011, which was described in a word as violent. Now, so because of that background, it became apparent to try and work towards building dialogue. Now, at the time, the idea of having dialogue coexisting alongside political competition sounded new, but also very attractive. And so it starts up, first of all, it sets up, first of all, to foster this dialogue that perhaps would not have been achieved on the floor of parliament, but dialogue that could be achieved outside parliament with the many protagonists, as Fred chose to call them, the political parties that had participated in the elections, but also had representatives in parliament, working along and trying to learn. It was a learning, trying to learn how do we get to dialogue with our former enemies, the people we were with in 2011, the people that had a situation where the party in power, you remember the Kakoza Mutale thing, the party in power had made sure that the opposition candidate at the time, who was Kizza Besigye, at the level of presidents, but also the other political parties, had faced such a rough time that it was difficult to forgive and also forget. So it became quite interesting and palatable to have IPOD tested and tried, and see how it would help us to paper over cracks, but also to kind of heal the wounds that had been opened during that violent general election of 2011.
Thank you, Henry. Yes, thank you for that. Fred, before you had issues with your internet, you were putting a point across. You can pick up from where you left.
Yeah, thank you, Liz, and thank you, Henry, for those remarks. Yes, I was saying that looking at the political parties, we need to understand the nature of these characters. Are they actually able to get into this space and actually dialogue? Are they built for that? Because if these political parties are actually doing the things that I was mentioning, things like reaching out to society, getting people's views, getting people's demands, and turn them into policies, and then push these policies as their basics. They depend on these policies. For example, if they are dealing with the environment, for them, they are interested in that. What do people say about the environment in this country? And they form policies about that. Then that means when they go into this space, they have an agenda, a specific agenda to look out for, something to speak about. But what is the agenda? What are the ideals of our characters in this scenario? Okay? If we remove these names, if we remove a name like NRM, if we remove a name like DP, like NOOP, what remains? What is there that can differentiate these political parties, that can help them sit around a table to discuss these divergent views? So that's what the point I was trying to make, that it's important to understand the characters before we even go to the dialogue table.
Thank you, Fred, and thank you for explaining to us in that manner. I've never had it explained that way. And that brings me to the next question. I'll keep up with you, Fred. Do you think that political dialogue can thrive alongside political competition based on Uganda's context, in the same way that you have explained it, given those different characters? Is it possible? Is this achievable?
Yeah, I would say yes and no. I would say yes. As a progressive Ugandan, I believe this is possible. But it has to, something has to be done about the characters, first and foremost. We cannot put the cart before the horse and expect to move forward. There will be a problem. We will get stuck before we start the journey. First of all, let's look at the democratic processes within these political parties. How do the leaders get into these positions? How, if we are to find a democracy gauge, what would be the scores at political party level? Because that determines, you don't expect a leader who has assumed the office through non-democratic processes or democracy that is questionable, to get to that level and actually practice democracy at the national level. They will have a problem because people hardly change, especially when it comes to power. We all know that power corrupts, and the absolute power corrupts absolutely. So just one reason, when you look at the background of our political parties, after every election in a political party, a new faction comes up. There are disagreements. No, these elections were rigged. No, that is not our president. No, for me, I belong to party so and so. My president is so and so. We know this in different parties. Now, these are the parties that we expect to get into the IPOD space and actually exercise democracy and actually discuss matters of national importance. I think there is a problem at that level. We need to get back to the basics and get some of these issues ironed out. Okay, then we can begin to look at dialogue. But also the other point I want to make, why I said no, because dialogue is delicate. In our situation, it's very hard to have a constructive dialogue, because dialogue in its nature is very delicate, to the extent that each and every word you use before and during the process matters, because the words we use describe us. They describe our characters. They tell the people who we are. What is it that we are thinking? But sometimes the words that our leaders utter are not, they cannot facilitate dialogue. By the time people get into the room, they're already in a fighting mood. They want to strangle each other. So dialogue becomes very, very tricky. So I think it's a yes and no, but like Henry said, this is something that is worthy attempting. We will need to go into it. We have no option because the option is actually very, very expensive. We can't afford it as a country.
Wow, thank you so much, Fred. And you mentioned something very important that I picked. Fred says dialogue is very fragile, it's very delicate. And that moves me to my next question. Abel, I'm going to bring you in. What are the minimum standards that must be in place for dialogue to happen in any nation? And in Uganda, do you think we have those minimum standards? Fred mentions that we have our leaders sometimes say some words that leave us wondering. We have had the president himself say he's going to crush the opposition. With those kinds of words, do you think dialogue can happen in Uganda? Do we have the standards in place?
Thank you, Liz. First of all, before I respond to that, I want to ask all to appreciate that political parties as organizations that are the heart of democracy, we do know that they always compete for political power, and through their competition, there are always issues that arise and create a lot of differences through those competitions. We have seen in various countries, also in Uganda and other parts of Africa, where we have seen whenever political parties are competing for power, we see a lot of things from secularization, militarization, violence, and commercialization of politics. And you find that most of the political parties that don't have access to some of these weapons are at a disadvantage. So you find that they leave the electoral process when they are not satisfied with how the process has been organized and managed. So that already creates an environment where there's a political party and others which have issues that need to be addressed. And one way of addressing those issues is through having a political dialogue. But now, coming back to your question, the minimum standards which we need to have in place to ensure that we can have a progressive political dialogue, one of it is having political tolerance. But you find that in most countries, once political parties and candidates have finished an electoral process, they don't need to talk to even each other. All the concerns, they always concentrate on now blackmailing, abusing, and attacking each other instead of them coming together in a round table and agreeing on some of the differences. They continue. You find that others are calling others dictators, some are being called pigs, some are being, so they label them in various ways. So you find that they don't tolerate each other. So it's very difficult for you to bring people on board who, first of all, don't espouse the spirit of political tolerance. So we need, first of all, have leaders and political parties that tolerate each other. If we have finished an election and there are issues or differences that we have seen through that electoral process when we are competing for political power, can we, as political parties and leaders, tolerate each other and say, okay, we have this, how can we come together and address this? But most of our political parties and candidates front their interest first, instead of fronting the national interest that can help the country grow. Because when we are building a nation, we need to put our personal differences aside. We need to first see what is that thing that benefits the country as a whole. So collectively, let's put our efforts first to the interests of the nation before we front our own interests. So the only problem in Africa we have is that political parties and candidates have really failed to appreciate that they can sit in the same round table with those people who have offended them from the process of competing for power. So they feel like we cannot share the same table with someone who has arrested us, tortured us, killed some of our supporters, and they are even not giving us space to organize, mobilize. So how do you expect us to go and dialogue with such people? So that's one of the issues that is affecting effective dialogue in Africa and Uganda in general.
Yes, thank you, Abel. So you mentioned that tolerance is one of the main aspects for dialogue to happen. But looking at Uganda, it's very obvious that political parties are not tolerant to one another. There's no respect. There's a lot of bitterness. Even in the opposition itself, opposition parties do not have respect for other opposition parties and they're bitter towards each other. Does that mean that we will never have effective dialogue based on the current situation?
I will go back to what one of our panelists, Fred, talked about, is the character of the leaders we have in place. If you have leaders who are bitter and do not tolerate others, then you cannot have an effective dialogue, because it goes back to the character of the leaders in place and the political parties in place. Do they really represent the interests of Ugandans, or they represent their own interests? So if you front your interests first, that means you will not need to negotiate with anyone concerning issues that are affecting Uganda at large. So you look at things from a personal level and you become emotive because you have not achieved your personal goals. So the character of the leaders we have in place can determine whether we can have a progressive political dialogue or not. So it's until we start looking at leaders from also their own personal characters. Because if you have a leader that has a weird personal character, don't expect that leader to come in place and say, I can sit with other leaders and dialogue in the same table, so that we can see that we can build a nation that represents Ugandans at large, not a nation that represents a few minority or ethnic group and leaves the rest of Ugandans outside. And this will always cause a lot of grievances and we cannot develop as a country.
Thank you, Abel, for that. And it's interesting that Fred brought up that issue of character and personal traits of the leaders that we have in place. Do you think dialogue is part of our DNA as Africans, Henry? Because this is not just a case of Uganda. We see a lot of conflict on the continent. We saw what happened during the Tojikwata incidents in Parliament. We saw how our honorable members of Parliament were tussling it out over there because they failed to talk. And we have seen such incidences across Africa in different parliaments. People end up having to blow punches here and there because they have failed to talk. Do you think it's part of our DNA as Africans? Because we see in Europe, they sit civically and discuss, but we have failed to see that in Africa. What do you think about this, Henry?
Thank you, Lisa. Of course, quite an interesting discussion. Now, when you look at African societies from the olden times, we used to live under kings and the feudal lords. At that time, we would get orders. It would be difficult for you to go and dialogue with the king over what? So when the colonialists came here, it was the same story. Them dictating us and giving us directions. It's either their way or the highway. And if you don't go do it their way, then you receive punishment. Now the leaders that took over from the colonial apparatus, I think, continued with the trajectory of the colonialists. But also, if you look at our society
Henry,
generally,
your internet is a bit shaky.
Okay. Yeah.
Henry, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. I can hear you, Lisa, and I think I can proceed. So,
Yes, you can proceed.
So if you look at our societies, even our own homes, the man and the woman in the home, I don't think many of them dialogue. If you look at the parent-child relationship, it is not one of dialogue. In many of our organizations, you have this big boss. So this whole thing carries over from the political parties we have. So the political parties we have are political parties that have strong leaders, strong men who have formed these political parties, men who are calling the shots, and many of these men who think and perceive of themselves as being larger than the party. If you start with the party in power, I think Mr. Museveni is larger than the party. Now, you have a man who has been so clear from the onset. He has told you in 2016 that come 2021, there will be no opposition political party standing. You clearly know that his interest is in ensuring that the regime survival enterprise continues to thrive and blossom. And therefore, when you talk about dialogue, political dialogue with who? Now, how do you dialogue with a man who thinks he's at this level and you at this lower level? I think for dialogue to take place and take root, it has to be that all of you accept and come to the same level, same table, and that you are all equal, and then you can dialogue. Now, that this is all part of the DNA we are living with. In the schools we go to, have you ever found students dialoguing with a headmaster or head teacher? This does not happen. Okay, so we are a society that is used to taking orders from above. Now, the man when you have a situation where you have an imperious president that wants to control and manipulate and reign over everything. So you talk about dialogue with who? So these are some of the things I think we are experiencing. But when you trace it, like you rightly said, it traces its roots from the very culture of the African society, where we are used to a situation where there are subjects and leaders, and that orders come from one direction, from the one on top to the one down, and that there is you who is down. All you have to do is to obey orders. It's either you obey orders or receive punishment. So this is the kind of society that we live in, that seems to have militated against the idea of political dialogue existing alongside political competition existing in Uganda. Back to you, Lisa.
Thank you, Henry, for breaking that down for us. Abel, I hope you can hear me. In Uganda, do we have a past record of using dialogue? And if so, has it yielded any gain? Has it worked? If we have.
Yeah, Uganda has had a history of dialogue from the past. First of all, Uganda as a nation, before we became a nation, we were under colonial rule by the British. And before we gained independence, we gained this independence through having diplomatic negotiations. We had representatives from political parties, kingdoms, local districts, and also other representatives who went and sat at Lancaster in the United Kingdom to negotiate on how Uganda should be governed. So we did not fight like other African countries that had to fight and killed each other. For us, we negotiated our country through dialogue. So that's one of the achievements which I can say. But whether it worked onwards, it's another thing. Because after the negotiations and gaining independence as a country, the leaders that were supposed now to govern Uganda as a nation, regardless of the ethnic backgrounds that they were in, failed to look at Uganda as a country by fronting the national interest first. We had issues whereby now we started looking at each other in our ethnic groupings, and we had a lot of crises from 1966. We saw the crisis of 1966, which emerged after there were issues between the Buganda Kingdom and the Uganda People's Congress of Apollo Milton Obote. They failed to agree on certain issues. So the dialogue that birthed Uganda failed during that time, and that escalated, and we saw the 1971 coup whereby Amin came and toppled off his leader, that was Apollo Milton Obote. But we also had dialogue, which was around 1979. That was in Arusha, in Moshi, in Tanzania, where the Ugandans who were in exile had to plan on how do we go back and fix our country, which they claim was being mismanaged by Idi Amin, who had come in through a military coup. So some of these leaders had to dialogue, they had to agree on how to go back to the country. And one of the things they espoused was that we need to go back and govern our country democratically. All the consensus we do make, they should be democratically agreed upon. So, but still after that, we saw they came into place, they held elections, 1980 elections. The elections were not held in a free and fair manner. That later saw Museveni go to the bush to fight the outcomes of the election. So to me, dialogue in Uganda has not achieved much, though we have had the history of having dialogue in place trying to address some of our political differences, but we have not achieved so much through dialoguing.
Thank you for that, Abel. We are going to go for a brief break and we'll be right back.
Welcome, my people. A cup of coffee, please. There is tea, everything, snacks are on the way.
Your thanks, but the reason that's why we are here, our people need improved defense services. We at least need an ambulance at every center.
My sub-county is the farthest. We used to depend on the former MP's vehicle, but when he lost his elections, he took away his vehicle.
Of course.
So what does that mean?
Use your budget as a district to procure the ambulances.
If I could, I would. But unfortunately, government operates differently.
I'm saying, Chairperson, this is very serious and urgent.
Yes. And why are they called local leaders then?
Local government.
You people, who sent you here?
I know, of course. We are concerned citizens who are watching people dying every day.
We've lost our beloved ones just because of poor health services.
Something has to be done.
You are right. Something has to be done, and very fast.
Yes.
That's transport for you. Go back.
But
All your concerns are taken care of. I will handle.
But
Have a
Chairman,
safe journey.
Thank you so much.
but this man seems to undermine our cause as to why we're here.
No, don't misunderstand me. This is just transport, no strings attached.
Chairman, we came here to discuss and find solution to our problems. But it seems you don't want to engage with us. Let's go and mobilize people, and you will see how serious we are.
Good citizens, let us always hold our leaders accountable. Leadership is a service, not a privilege.
Contribute today at www.politicalfinanceafrica.org/donate. Together, we can contribute towards enhancing democracy as a viable system of governance in Uganda.
Welcome back from that short break. And if you have just joined us, we are discussing political dialogue and political competition, whether this is a myth or reality for Uganda. Before we broke off, our panelists had shared some really insightful thoughts. And last year, we saw Uganda's biggest opposition political party, the National Unity Platform, decline to join IPOD, with claims that the platform has largely been used by the regime to legitimize a brutal regime that has no respect for democracy. We have also, over time, had threats by FDC to boycott the platform. Fred, what do you have to say about these parties being hesitant in joining IPOD? Fred, please unmute.
Yes. Sorry about that. Thank you, Liz, and thank you, fellow panelists, for the views so far shared. I would call this kind of situation a hide and seek kind of game, which is not productive at all. It doesn't help anyone, but of course it has its reasons. Looking back at the foundation of the space we are discussing, looking at IPOD as a space, what is the foundation like? How strong is this foundation? Was it established in a way, in a manner that could allow all people with all parties with different political views to be accommodated, or was it developed depending on the characters that were around then. When they face these challenges, what are they doing actually to rectify this? Like I did say, and Abel did allude to that, dialogue is very, very delicate, particularly in a nascent democracy like ours. It is even harder. But also there are other factors that make it even very hard. And one of those factors is what has the message that has just been shared through that drama, that leadership is a service, not a privilege. But in Uganda, leadership is a privilege. As long as we still have that scenario, dialogue becomes very, very hard, because nobody is going to negotiate himself out of Luombo. Nobody will go on a table to negotiate how to throw away his plate. Okay? You don't expect that. But if leadership was looked at as a service, where one goes to contribute to society in a political perspective, then that is different. It is easy to negotiate. It is easy for one to bring their ideas, and they are respected, where even if they are minority views, they would be respected, because the whole agenda, the whole issue is not to outsmart the other, is not stopping you from accessing your next meal, but it's about making the country better. So I think looking at that, I talked about the aspect of language. All these issues come about because of some of these factors, okay? We have had statements like my oil. I mean, these are very unfortunate statements, okay? These are very unfortunate statements. Even some opposition leaders make statements that leave you wondering and say, what are we dealing with? Where is this country headed to? For any dialogue process to happen, even how you refer to each other is important. Can our politicians refer to themselves as colleagues of alternative interests? Okay? Let me be very specific now. Can Honorable Kyagulanyi look at His Excellency President Yoweri Museveni as a colleague of alternative interest? Can they refer to each other in that language? The day we will begin hearing such language used by our national politicians, then we will know we are headed in the right direction. You did ask a question before the break, whether we have seen dialogue work for Uganda. I think, yes, we have had dialogues here, but every time there has been a dialogue, there have also been scheming at the back of the dialogue. I remember in 1985, during the Nairobi peace talks, General Tito Okello, the government of the Okellos was negotiating with the rebel group led by Museveni, then now the president. They were negotiating in Nairobi. After signing the peace agreement, there was a public rally at State Square. I attended in person. And what was the statement that the president made? He said, Museveni ni nyoka, lakini leo tumetoa meno. Meaning that the person they have been negotiating with is a snake, of which they have now removed the teeth. Can you imagine? The very day they signed the peace agreement in Nairobi, when he arrived in the country, he addressed a public rally at Constitutional Square. It was called State Square then. And I was there in person. I heard his words myself. I did not read in the papers. But interestingly, on the other side, the rebels were also not actually negotiating. They were simply buying time. Immediately after that, massacre was blocked off. And from the guerrilla war, we went into an open war. And that's how the Okero government lost it. So, talking about dialogue in Uganda, because it is about winner takes it all. It is about, it is now our time to eat. It is not about the country. The country always becomes secondary. This is the biggest problem, and this is why dialogue is not thriving in this country. Back to you, please.
Thank you so much, Fred, and thank you for sharing some of that information that we would have probably never have known of. And what you raise is really interesting. It's why have opposition political parties in Uganda failed to distinguish between regime and country, Henry? Fred talks about people it's time to eat. Everyone is struggling for their time to eat. So we often hear opposition parties saying when their time comes. Why do you think they have failed to distinguish between regime and the country's interests?
Thank you very much, Lisa, and thank you, Fred, for those insightful views. Earlier on, there was a comment by Felix Vian that leadership, dialogue, is one of the signs that would show you that a country's leadership has matured. And by a leadership maturing, it takes you to what Fred earlier on said again, when he talked about leadership as a service. In our country, people don't go into leadership to serve. They go there to fulfill and achieve selfish interests. And because they go into positions of leadership for selfish interests, they fail to see the bigger picture. So to the question you've asked, when you look around, all opposition political parties, including the new one, NUP, that is purporting they were not going to join IPOD in order to sit on the same table with M7, who has been oppressing, kidnapping, detaining, and harassing, and also killing their own supporters. You get the idea that there is a failure by the leaders of these political parties to make a clear distinction between the regime and the country. Because if you went into leadership, if you went into political space to serve the country, you would then have known, as a Chagulanyi or Amuriat or any other political party leaders, that leadership politics is a contestation of ideas. It's a contest. And therefore, also in politics, it is not possible that the one holding political power is going to give it out on a silver platter. Therefore, there's going to be a contestation. There's going to be a fight. And therefore, because the one who is in power is also owning the instruments of coercion, you would expect him to leverage that power and use them in his or her favor. And therefore, when you start to contest and challenge this person, these are the things you expect. I would assume that these leaders of political parties go through a session called scenario building. And therefore, when you face the wrath of this leader, who is in power, who did not come to power through elections, you would expect this. And therefore, for them to keep insisting that they cannot sit with themselves, you get the impression that there is a way, a sense in which they are obsessed with Museveni, the man. Yet, the one they want to serve is the country. And I think the day they will learn to draw the line between Museveni, his regime, because this regime is also in the evening of its stay. They tell us, our grandfathers in Africa, that even the longest snake has a tail. And once the tail has arrived, then you know the snake has passed. So for any meaningful leader, you would imagine that they put country interests first, that when the interests of the country come into the picture, then the issue of Museveni has done this to us doesn't arise. Therefore, you understand that it is of no consequence to boycott joining IPOD, because IPOD is a platform for dialogue. Dialogue is a marathon. It takes time, it takes leadership, it takes tolerance, it takes resilience, it takes determination. This is the time for them to demonstrate by word and deed that they are actual leaders. But by saying we are not coming to dialogue, and the reason, Museveni, you get to see that they have clearly failed to separate and draw a clear distinction between regime and country. And I would appeal to the leaders of these political parties to understand that leadership is a service, that the service is to the country, and that even if it were them in the shoes of Museveni today, they would have done what they did. But they need to tolerate and be resilient. I have always said that the political leaders of today are so weak because our grandfathers who fought for independence across Africa faced a far more ruthless machine or enemy in form of the colonial machinery than these ones are facing in Museveni and the NRM regime. So all they have to do is to understand, number one, that dialogue is a marathon. You don't say that IPOD, the idea that K was introduced 10 years back, has not achieved anything, and therefore we have no justification to join. The outcome, the fruits of dialogue could be seen 50 years from today. And therefore, for them not to see this is really appalling and annoying. The other thing is that democracy is a constant work in progress. So all the time you should have actors that are ready and willing to hang in there and keep pushing. Okay? So this snake they are looking at, they are saying is biting them, also has a tail. So the tail will come and go. But can we see them putting country first and drawing a clear distinction? Because I've been appalled when they go out of Uganda. The way they speak about Uganda, they transfer their dislike and hatred for the regime. They transfer that to the country, and they speak as bad about the country Uganda as they speak about the regime. And I think the day this will happen is the day we shall begin to show it to see leadership. And therefore, my point is that it is wrong for our leaders of NUP and FDC to refuse to engage in this dialogue, because this dialogue is not from seven or their parties. It is dialogue for the citizens. It is dialogue for the country. And anybody that wants to be seen as a future leader of this country should be able and willing to demonstrate by word and deed that they can engage in dialogue. Back to you, Lisa.
Thank you, Henry. However, I'm sure you've heard the assertion by the public that says that the regime and the state seem to be one. So can you really fault NUP for thinking the same? It's really difficult in this era that we are in to differentiate between the state and the current regime. What do you have to say?
Thank you very much, Lisa. The reason they call people leaders and others subjects is because you, as a leader, you should transcend over and above common talk, common perceptions, traditions, and so on. And therefore, whereas it is true that Museveni is the regime and the regime is Museveni, the party is the government, and the government is the NRM, the bigger picture tells us that everything, and this is a natural law, everything that has a beginning must have an end. There must be an end to this regime, like it or not. Upende uspende, there must be an end. And therefore, for you to keep fronting as an excuse a regime that is in the evening of its stay, I think it is a failure to exercise leadership. Once again, we want them to have a bigger, to be able to demonstrate that they're able to project this country over and above the regime, and that the regime should not be used as an obsession. And by making the regime an obsession, they are failing to see logic and see the bigger picture. Back to you, Lisa.
Thank you. Thank you, Henry. So, Abel, Uganda has one of the youngest populations in the world, with about 78% of its population below 30 years. We, however, don't see these young people, and women inclusive, on the IPOD table. Who is representing their interests? And can the youth entrust the old people to represent them?
Thank you, Lisa. This goes back to the kind of political parties we have in place. We know that political parties are supposed to be nursery beds that nurture leaders that will take up the leadership positions of the country in the future. But we often see that most of these political parties have been turned into personal enterprises that do not even nurture leaders that should come over and take over the leadership mantle of the country. That's why you see that most of the youth and women have been blocked, or there are certain barriers that are in place that are blocking them from coming up and participating in some of these processes where political parties are engaging in. So the privileges are left for a few, as we all know. A few individuals within those political parties want to eat everything, and they're excluding some of the youth and the women from participating in this dialogue. But one way I believe that the youth and women could participate in this process is they should demand, they should not even just wait for these political parties and the leaders who are in there for their own selfish benefits and interests to close them or leave them out whenever they're having this process of dialoguing. They need to demand to be in those spaces. They need to push back and ensure that they are in those spaces, regardless of some of the barriers within the political parties. We have seen that these guys have mastered the art of facing the positions for themselves, either by introducing laws that block away the youth and women, or commercializing the entire internal political processes of their political parties, so that they are the only ones who are eligible or who can go through the processes, and they leave out the young people and the women from participating. So the youth need to come up, wake up, and also the women need to wake up from their comfort zones, and they push back and demand for changes maybe in some of the processes in those political parties, so that they can be able to participate, to go through and be leaders in some of the spaces which require them to participate in some of those spaces. Because I do know there's no political party in Uganda that has so far a very youthful or young Secretary General who goes into and negotiates with others for the benefit of the youth. So if IPOD is really a space where even the youth, which are the majority, are supposed to be part, they should be seen participating in such spaces. They should not just wait to be ready for things which some other people have agreed upon. How will you know the interests of the youth if the youth does not participate? How will you know the interests of the women if women are closed from those spaces? So I do believe it's high time, as political parties which have the responsibility of nurturing leaders. One way of nurturing leaders is making sure that they should participate through those processes. If they don't participate, how will they learn? And how will they become leaders who are transformative in nature, who can bring about development in the country if you're blocking them out? And if you have a few privileged individuals who are using political parties to amass their own wealth instead of fronting the interest of Ugandans. So I think it's high time youth and women start demanding to participate in those spaces.
Yes, thank you, Abel. Thank you for that. And it is indeed high time that we, the youth, took up those spaces. So, Fred, Henry earlier mentioned the dynamics in our African culture of how, as a subject, you cannot dialogue with a king. And that brings me to my next question. Can a party in a disadvantaged position have meaningful dialogue, especially looking at our dominant party syndrome here in Africa? Most times we have dominant parties over the smaller parties. Can they have meaningful dialogue?
Yeah, thank you, Liz. Yeah, going straight to the question, I believe it is possible if If the dialogue is well structured, and if this political party is well prepared and organized, if they have issues to articulate, issues to present, because in a dialogue, you bring what you have on table, I bring what I have. It is a workshop of ideas. Now I'm talking in an ideal situation, an ideal dialogue situation, where you have a competent facilitator and where the participants actually have respect for each other. So whether this party is disadvantaged, they still carry their own heads. They still have their own ideas. They have worked out something. And if this they have is for the good of the country, and they bring it to the table, everybody will appreciate them. Everybody will say, yeah, you know, when NUP actually went to IPOD, they did suggest A, B, C. But because these parties who were already there could not swallow what they presented, they could not actually take it on. But we believe that's a good idea. And that would be a score on their side. But staying outside, we don't get to realize how good you are. How do we know this is not just an excuse for you not to undress yourself in public to show your weakness in terms of engaging? So this is what I think, that as national political parties, they should have national agendas. Actually, one thing they should begin doing, if I were one of them, I would pass it like a rule that nobody should talk about President Museveni as a person anymore. If political parties did that for 2 years, where none of them actually talks about him, but talks about Uganda and what they believe, what they think, and what they are planning for the country, just to convince us, to show us that, yeah, they are looking beyond the man, because the man will definitely go at one point, but this country will be here for years to come. So I think the mindset, okay, the mindset has to change. Their approaches have to get better. Their strategies have to be improved, because we can't continue listening to the same song that FDC was singing, now it's NUP singing. We get bored.
Yes.
Can we?
Fred, I'm going to have to cut you short there. Our time is
please.
running fast. Yes, so
Okay.
if you could kindly wind up.
Wind up. Yeah. So let's get a new song. Let's get a new approach from these political parties. Disadvantaged as they are, they can still do something about this situation. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Fred. Henry, kindly give us your concluding remarks. Our time is fast spent.
Thank you, Lisa. My parting shot is that Uganda has everything to gain when it goes down the path of dialogue. We want to see dialogue at political party level. We want to see dialogue at national level. We want to see dialogue in homes, dialogue in institutions. Dialogue is the only way we are going to nurture and grow our democracy. We have tried violence before. Violence has not helped us. We now want to pursue democracy as the most viable system of governance. So dialogue is the way forward. Back to you, Lisa.
Thank you so much, Henry. Abel, please give us your parting shots before we go.
Thank you. All I want to tell the political parties, they need to understand that political power is always competed for, and through the competition of this political power, there are always very many things that happen. There are always disagreements. They always have issues that arise through that competition for power. So the only way they can address such differences so that they can come up with solutions that can help the country grow through dialogue. So regardless of what happens, political competition and political dialogue has to always move hand in hand. We shouldn't ignore it.
Thank you so much, Abel, and thank you all our panelists. It's been a really interesting conversation. I also want to thank the viewers that tuned in, all those that sent in comments, and I hope to see you next week, same time, same place. God bless you.